Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever struggled with a great loss in your life, then do we have the Finding Meaning show for you. Today I'll be talking with David Kessler, the world's foremost expert on grief, the co-author of On Grief and Grieving and Life Lessons with Elizabeth Kubler Ross, and You Can Heal Your Heart with Louise Hay, and his latest and perhaps most important creation, Finding Meaning. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about the sixth stage of grief and what it means for all of us. That, plus we'll talk about butterflies and hospice, visiting Yosemite, extra long spoons, the Holiday Inn Superdome, a call light flashing green, a boogeyman in the closet, 148 passengers, and flying solo at 13, and what in the world a giant purple elephant has to do with anything. So welcome to the show, David. Are you ready to shine?
I am here in Los Angeles. It's shiny always, even through our fires. So
Very, very good and a mighty woohoo! So today we're going to talk about your story and the 5 stages of grief, and then dive into the 6th stage and how it can help heal our soul. But before we do that, what's one thing we can do in this moment if we're grieving a loved one to feel even just a little bit better?
well, the first thing you could do is to know there is no right or wrong in grief. You are not doing it wrong. The only thing that challenges us is trying to avoid what organically we're doing.
Thank you. And so, speaking of avoidance, I almost didn't have you on this show. And yet, here you are. And I want to share a little bit about the miracle that took place here and why your book is so important. Last night was Halloween. I had a very, very hard night last night. In fact, my wife Jessica, our father-in-law, was visiting, or has visited. He just flew in last night. So she was with him. I was kind of off by myself alone. And I just felt like crying because last year at this time was our first, I'm probably going to cry here in a second, first of 2 miscarriages over the last year, along with the death of a dear friend, and last month the death of a pet. And last year at this time, we were seeing all the kids trick-or-treating around and talking about how next year, how next year we would be with our baby out there. And so and we were at Whole Foods last night and just seeing, like, we got out of the car. We have a bright yellow Tesla, and got out, and two parents were going by with their kids, and they're like, "You have a yellow Peep just like us." And they're like, "What do you mean?" And they pointed at my car and then pointed at their baby dressed up in the identical bright yellow. And it was really, really hard. So I want to say how special it is to have you on the show today, and how everything in life happens for a reason, and what incredible timing it is. So thank you first off. From that,
So,
yes.
Michael, thank you. And I just want to say, you, like everyone else, goes, "Oh, I might cry." And I tell people, those are tears of love.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that we have this notion we should fight tears of love. And so we all go through losses. It's what makes us part of the human race. And I'll tell you, in the book, it was devastating for me. And I got a lot of pushback as I talked about writing a chapter on miscarriage. People would go, "But you're a guy." And I would go, "I'm a grief expert, and I would be really in trouble to not include miscarriages in a book on grief." And I made sure I learned so much from the women that I interviewed for that chapter, as well as for the men I interviewed. Just like, you are modeling how we are touched by loss. And those miscarriages, the losses mean something. Those children mean something to your wife and to you. So I'm glad you're modeling that and talking openly about that.
Thank you. And it's interesting. Later in the book, you talk about the practical griever, which
Right.
would be me. In fact, my wife made a comment this morning. She goes, "No, I'm just joking." And I'm like, "No, no, you weren't. There's a thread of two. She goes, oh, you're going to cry. Now you're going to finally grieve. And I'm like, no, I've been grieving through the process. I
Right.
just do it differently. As soon as, as crap goes down, my job is as what I feel the provider, how can I put the world back together at least a
Right.
little
You're a
bit for
fixer.
us?
You're a fixer. Right. So am I. I get it.
So let's go from there, and forgive me for the segue. Would you mind sharing what happened with your son?
Sure. So I'll give you sort of the big picture of this. I had been curious. I had written the 5 stages or adapted Kubler Ross's stages.
Mhm.
I had written a book with Elizabeth adapting her well-known, well-loved stages for dying to grief.
Yeah.
And did that in 2000 in the book On Grief and Grieving. And Elizabeth would be appalled at what people have done with her stages. You know, they've made it into the 5 steps, and Elizabeth was a messy, organic person who was the opposite of a rule follower. And now somehow in our society, it's become these 5 organized stages you must go through, which is the furthest from what she would have intended. And the other thing I noticed that there was a finality that was given to acceptance, as if grief ends, and grief does not end. Hopefully, in time, we will grieve with more love than pain, but we will always miss the person who's gone. So I thought a lot about, and Elizabeth and I had talked about this idea of, is there a 6th stage? And I certainly thought about this idea of meaning.
Yes.
You know, I don't know that we're a generation that's just okay with acceptance. I think we want to find meaning. So I wrote some chapters about meaning, thinking I wonder someday might this be a book. And I wrote the chapters and I put it aside, knowing I would get back to it at some point. And probably about a year later, I was lecturing on the East Coast and I received a call that my younger son, David, 21 years old, had unexpectedly died. And it was the most brutal thing I'd ever been through. You know, there's a lot of people that thought that, you know, maybe as being the grief expert, it would be different for me. And I would respond to that by going, the grief expert didn't have a son die. The father had to bury his son. So I, you know, was like everyone else. I was brought to my knees when loss happens. And, you know, I did all the things I've told people over the years to do. I took time for my grief. I went to support groups. I went to grief counseling and canceled lectures probably about a month or 2 into the grief. I was just around my office, bumping into things, going through things that had piled up. And I found these chapters on finding meaning. And I picked them up and I look like, yeah, like that's going to help with this pain. I was sure nothing would help with the pain. And I started reading the chapters on meaning. The pain didn't go away, but all of a sudden I felt a cushion. I felt a shift. And I realized meaning is so important in loss. And so that became a journey to write this book, which really helped bring me so much healing. And to write the book, the 6th stage of grief, finding meaning. And it was also an opportunity to reiterate and maybe clear up some of those misunderstandings that the stages of grief are not linear. We go through them many times. Your grief is very unique. There is no map of grief. There is no one way to grieve. So it was a chance to go back and do that. And it was also a remarkable chance to not only delve into my own grief, but to write from a deeper place. And I remember when I finished the book, I was just sitting there in tears, and I thought, my hope is that this will help other people the way it's helped me. So, and now here we are a few years later, and the book's coming out. So it's becoming a reality.
And while what I always tell people when I work with them in grief, loss is loss. You can't you can ascribe meaning to it, but the loss is still loss. So with that said, we can choose to have the meaning that your son's passing has now meant through this book so much for others.
Well, and that's one of the things I talk about in the book is that when we hear meaning, you know, people go, wait, what's there? There's no meaning in murder. There's no meaning in tragedy. There's not meaning in the death. Loss is what happens in life. Meaning is what we do after the loss. It's what we have control over after the loss has happened.
And it's what when the time is right, and that's the big thing is today we want to use mindfulness to fix something. We want to use the 5 steps now, steps rather than stages to fix something. It's time to get on, but it is.
And to remember, in grief, there is nothing to fix because you are not broken.
Thank you.
You are grieving. You are not broken. You are grieving. That is what grief looks like.
And just to go down this road for one more segment, in this culture at least, and people listen to this in every country around the world, but in this culture, we also say the world goes on. You may be grieving, but I've got to get back to an appointment. We got to do this. We got to do that. Come on, get with it too. Rather than you talk about the Aboriginals in Northern Australia moving furniture. Everybody at everybody's house.
That was amazing. When I went to Australia, and I'm going to be going there again for this book tour. When I went to Australia a few years ago, a researcher, because I talk about this concept that grief must be witnessed. We want our grief witnessed by one other person. We're not meant to be islands of grief. So I'm in Australia talking about that concept, and a researcher says to me, "Oh, I researched these tribes in the rural areas in northern Australia, and they told me the night someone dies, everyone in the village moves a piece of furniture in their house or changes something in their yard." And the researcher said, "Why do you do that?" And they said, "Because we want the family to wake up the next morning after their death and see, now that their loved one has died, everything has changed." Which is so different than us in Western culture, where exactly like you say, we wake up the next morning and our world is changed forever, but everyone goes on about their business like no big deal. So it's that idea that not to be these isolated beings of grief, but to know we're connected in this human experience.
Thank you. I want to go back in time now. We're going to go into a little bit of a time machine, kind of Wayne's World, all the way back to New Year's Eve 72. Because if we ascribe meaning to it, or what I call pulling the golden thread backwards, we can see that you were kind of almost ordained to do this work. What took place both New Year's Eve and in the weeks that followed for you?
So I often say, I don't know that you find this work as much as this work found me. And my mother had been had a kidney removed before I was born, so she was in and out of hospitals. And New Year's Eve, 1972, I went in. It was almost New Year's. I kissed her and wished her a happy New Year and said, this is the year you're going to get better. And obviously that wasn't true. What ended up happening is a few days later, she was hospitalized and had to be transferred to the hospital in the big city, which was New Orleans. And while she was in this sterile ICU that I couldn't go into a lot of the time because I was 13 and you need to be 14.
Yeah.
And it was only 5 minutes, I think, every 2 hours. I spent a lot of time in the lobby. My father spent time in the lobby. He also couldn't afford a hotel. So we were sleeping in the lobby of the hospital. And at one point, we started walking over outside the hospital. Just, we had so much time on our hand. There was nothing around the hospital. There was no coffee shop. There was no store. The only thing across the street was the hotel that we couldn't afford. So we started going over there, and I realized now he was probably checking rates to see if he could pay them later or something, because there wasn't internet or cell phones back then.
Yeah.
We never got to stay in the hotel, but we ended up in the lobby of the hotel. At one point, it just became a distraction, a place we went to during our day. It was ICU, lobby, ICU, lobby of the hospital, the hotel. We're in the hotel, and all of a sudden, people start screaming fire. Everyone runs out. We look up on the 18th floor, and these flames are coming out. Fire trucks pull up, and we realize it is as the fire trucks are extending their ladder, shooting begins. And everyone realizes this isn't just a fire, this is an active shooter. And so everyone's just shocked by that, running for their lives. It went on for 13 hours. It was one of the first mass shootings in the US. And they finally, 13 hours later, shot the 23-year-old shooter. And it's a lesson now in everything you should not do. The chief of police was killed. They shot him with 200 bullets. It's just a matter of like everything you would not do. And we eventually got back to the hospital. My mother died the next morning. I wasn't able to be with her. I went on my first plane ride.
Well, I'll pause you there, because this has to do with an important part of your story. There was I guess a rules nurse who was by the book, 5 or 10 minutes every couple hours, and to see somebody. And if you're not 14 or older and you were 13, you are absolutely not allowed in entry, which means, I'm so sorry, David, your mom passed away alone and you didn't get to see her to say goodbye.
Correct. And I'll tell you, at a young age, I knew this could have been done better. I knew this wasn't, it's interesting. My mind did not go to mom shouldn't die. My mind, because somehow I accepted the reality that I was losing her. Mm-hmm. But I knew that a sterile ICU is not how we say goodbye from the waiting room or from the lobby. And so after that, she died. I'm on my first plane ride. The pilot hears that my mother died. There was a shooting. He invites me up to the cockpit. He gets up, has me sit in the pilot's seat, instructs me on how to fly the plane. You and I know I was never flying the plane. I don't remember whether there was a co-pilot or whether there was autopilot, but we just know now it was a good gesture. Yeah. And so, in my mind, my mother has died. Mm-hmm. There's been a shooting, and now I have to save 148 people on this airline. It's a lot for a child to handle. So I came out of that experience. It's interesting. People go, I don't get you. You worked in hospital administration. You're in mental health. You do aviation disasters. You're a specialist reserve police officer. What's all that about? It's about those 3 days. Maybe I became someone that could have helped that kid. So now, those days, those moments helped me now try to find a better way for people to experience the last chapter of their life, whether it's in the hospital or hospice, when there's tragedies, shootings, sudden death, to help people in those circumstances. In a way, I was able to find meaning and turn that meaning into a career that now helps other people, I hope.
I would say absolutely. You're helping us here today, and if you're helping us, I'm convinced, I'm putting my arms around all of the people who are listening. You're helping everybody because we all, if there's one certainty in life, we will experience loss. Not a single one of us will avoid it.
Right.
What is fine? Thank you.
And I just want to say, for people who might be listening going, oh, I haven't had a death. I've had these other losses, but they're not real grief. I teach people, when you have a breakup, it is the death of a relationship. When you have a divorce, it is the death of a marriage. When you have a betrayal, it's maybe the death of trust. When you have a job loss, it's the death of that job and those relationships. So they're all grief. They're all different forms of grief we experience in this life. And for me, what I hope this book helps people do is whatever loss you're dealing with. I know your bug just went across there.
I am blown away by this, David. It has been fascinating. This is only the second time this has ever happened.
Is this a ladybug? What do you have there?
It is called a box elder beetle, and I've looked it up, and it's definitely fortuitous. It's definitely a good sign, but it just keeps coming back to join us on camera here.
Well, so I was saying that whatever you've been through, my job is to help you bring your whole self, not your broken self, but your whole self to the rest of your life after the divorce, after the breakup, after the betrayal, after the death. How can you live the rest of your life whole and not broken?
Thank you. What do you tell people when they ask, how long am I going to be grieving?
I tell them, how long is the person going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead, you're going to grieve for a long time. But grief is not just about pain. Grief is also about love, and I want to help them in time, at their own pace, grieve with more love than pain.
Thank you. And you talk about something going out of alignment. If we try to avoid sadness and grief, what happens?
Well, first of all, we end up with this, just river of misery in our lives that we don't understand.
Mhm.
And we name situational sadness depression now. And the truth is, you're supposed to be sad when you get divorced. You're supposed to be sad when someone dies.
Thank you.
We're not supposed to avoid those moments of life. We're a culture now that our advertisement and everything talks about hitting that peak and climbing that mountain and being on the top of everything. We also have to appreciate the valleys of life. No one gets to go through the top of every mountain. We all go through valleys. If you're on the top of this mountain, the only way to get to the top of that mountain is to go through a valley. And we're all going to have ups and downs in our lives. And we don't often have the muscles anymore to go through those valleys. We don't know how to do that.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because death is something that, again, here in the Western world, it's sort of like nursing home and hospice. We put everybody out of the way. We don't want to see that. It doesn't exist. It doesn't take place. And I think that can do irreparable harm rather than good.
There's a horrible cost to that. And, it's those things are so important to look at those times of life. I mean, the reality for many people is the best care may be in the nursing home. The best care may be in the hospital. Hospice is one of the greatest assets we have. So, the form doesn't matter. Really, what I'm talking about is we don't know how to be present with them. In so many ways, I am teaching people what our great grandparents knew. how to be with the dying, how to be with our grief, how to live with the loss, not get over the loss.
Thank you. It brings up, I was going to ask about it at the end, but I haven't read it, but I really, really want to read this book. Um, uh, what is it? Visions, Trips, and Crowded Rooms.
Right. I was so curious about end of life experiences and how I hear it. Someone called me the other day and asked me if I've ever heard of it. And I'm like, I wrote a book about it. I was so curious about how at the end of life, people see loved ones who have already died. The dead come to greet the dying. And so I wrote a book, and my research was around interviewing doctors, nurses, social workers, psychologists, priests, rabbis, ministers, all those professionals who are with people at the end of life to talk about their experiencing and witnessing their clients and their patients, seeing people who have died come to them. So we call them deathbed visions. And it's a phenomenon that happens around the world in all different cultures. And we minimize it, and yet it's a reality that seems to happen.
They see people, they hear things, there's a crowded room.
Right. People see crowds, people talk about they got to go on a trip.
Yeah.
Even the word hospice comes from an old Latin word that means a way station where we rest before our final trip. Wow. Or a big journey.
So let's go from there, and let's talk about meaning, dive really deep into meaning. Actually, before I do that, something you were just bringing up right before this last segment, the word judgment is so important, or a lack of judgment, to allow yourself, am I grieving all right? Is my grieving going well? Am I supposed to be grieving like this? Am I not? Well, I'm supposed to be done. My friends say I need to get back out there now.
So we are the only generation that we now have feelings on feelings. We are sad, but we feel like we have no right to be sad because our loved one lived to 80 and someone else's child dies, or our mind says it was just a pet, but your heart is broken. And we're angry, but then we think it's inappropriate. So we have these feelings, and then we have all these comments on whether we should or shouldn't have the feelings. So I urge people to stay in their first generation emotions, to ignore the comments of your mind. Your feelings are meant to be felt just because they exist. You are to feel them. And we can't heal what we don't feel. So there's no way around it. And people get afraid of, like, there's a gang of feelings. You hear all the time, if I start crying, I might not be able to stop. I've been with thousands of people. Everyone stop crying. Everyone stop crying. What you'll do is you'll feel a feeling fully, and then you'll go to the next feeling. And then you'll go to the next feeling. The problem is when we go, I don't want to feel that feeling, I don't want to feel that one's wrong, that I shouldn't have. We have all these feelings that get half felt, and we never really experience grief. We're only judging feelings.
So I'm going to bring it back full circle to what I was when we started, and I started to cry on air, and I shut myself down deliberately, because if the host just starts crying uncontrollably, it would make for a very different show. However, what do I do, or someone does in my situation? Not grief is grief. It doesn't matter from where it came from. Who shut themselves down, and now we want to fully experience this. I call it leaning into it, so we can go to what? Yeah.
So first of all, grief doesn't need a lot of time. It needs dedicated time. So if you have a few moments that you tear up, you're correct. You're at work. You're in a position like I am when I lecture. If I talk about my son and I tear up, thank goodness I'm with an audience that they're okay with it. But you're right. I could not just sit down on a chair and cry for the rest of the lecture, nor could you do that on this show. But what you have to acknowledge is, oh, there's grief inside of me. So let me make sure I give that some dedicated time. People go, but you don't understand, I'm at work. You can go take a walk at lunch and cry. You can cry in your shower every morning. You can say at work, when you feel yourself tear up, I'm going to run to the restroom, I'll be right back. And you don't have to tell everyone, I'm not going to the bathroom, I'm really going to cry. But you acknowledge those feelings and you give them a moment. And when you go into the bathroom for 3 minutes and take a break and allow yourself, oh my goodness, what was that sadness I was feeling there? Oh, I'm missing this person, I love this person. You will fully cry for 3 minutes. And then you'll be done for then, and you'll be able to go back to work.
Thank you. From there, I'm always big on writing exercises for people. What's the benefit of writing when it comes to meaning? And how did writing personally help you when writing from your mom and dad's perspective?
Sure. So writing has been shown to help with grief and trauma. Now, it's interesting just to mention, all grief is not trauma, but all trauma has grief in it. And writing has been shown to help. I mean, I have an online writing class where we write about our trauma and our grief and our losses. So we all find ways to deal with it. And writing has been so important. I think one of the reasons it's so important is it allows us to witness our own grief. And it allows us to deal with the thoughts of our mind. So it's interesting what you alluded to is years ago, and I do this in the writing class, I did a writing exercise for myself where I told that story about the hospital years ago, but instead of writing it from my perspective, I wrote it as my father. What was those events like for my father?
And you'd been very upset, angry.
I had horrible judgment on my father. He handled grief horribly. Then suddenly when I wrote his story, oh my gosh, what's it like to have your wife dying? What's it like to have a child you don't know how to care for? What's it like to not be able to afford a hotel? What it's like to have your wife in the ICU? I went from having a place of judgment on my father to a place of having compassion. The other thing I teach people is this concept: pain from loss is inevitable, suffering is optional. I can't take away your pain of your pet dying, your spouse dying, your child, your parent dying, your friend dying, the divorce. I can't take that pain away, but I can help ease your suffering. And suffering is what our crazy mind does, telling us we shouldn't feel that way, or it's our fault, or it's their fault, or the blame. So it's interesting, when I wrote about my mother's death, and I did that exercise with her for the first time, and I was probably in my late 20s or 30s, I was writing about her dying, and I realized my life had always been, I had talked about my mother had left me, my mother had abandoned me, I was abandoned at a young age. When I wrote her story, it made me realize for the first time, my mother did not abandon me, my mother died. Abandonment was the additional suffering my mind was causing me. And I'd been a horrible victim of life. And once I did that writing exercise, it shifted things enormously.
Thank you. I feel called. I wasn't planning on going there, but I have a client whose mom, I believe, has chosen, under doctor's suggestion, that it's time to stop eating. You don't need to eat anymore. You don't need to do anything. When you're ready to check out, it's time to go. What does one do when they have a loved one in this circumstance?
So, first of all, the medical profession is not good at this interface. The way it plays out is it is a primal need. It is a primal feeling of love to feed someone. We believe food is nourishment. So what happens is when our body is winding down,
Mhm.
and our job is to listen to our body when it is winding down. We want to keep feeding our loved one.
Mhm.
And the medical profession will sometimes go, no, you're wrong. You should not feed them. They're dying. But I recognize when people are trying to feed their loved one who's dying, what an amazing act of love. Of course, you want to keep feeding your loved one because you love them. You want them to be nourished. You want a turnaround. You want them to get better. And to help them understand, and hospice is so great about doing it, there comes a time when the body is winding down that forcing food into a body that's dying would be a horrible thing to do. And so we have to do a better job of recognizing that. So that's what I would tell your client, to listen to their loved one's body. You know, if someone's in hospice or in the hospital and they're awake and alert and they're like, I'm hungry, get me some food. Oh my gosh, of course. But if they're unconscious and their body is winding down, we don't want to shove food in them. That their body can no longer digest it the way it could.
It's fascinating. I'm looking off on the side of the studio. I have a red service vest from my service dog, Sawa, for 16 years. And in her last year, she had a pancreas condition, and we had to feed her every day. And it is something that when she passed afterwards, I had to do a lot of work on myself because I felt that she had been trying for a long time to say, Daddy, it's time for me to go home. And it was for me, really, in a sense, rather than for her, I was trying to hold on.
Well, and that's why in this book I really wanted to also have a chapter on when someone's dying, finding meaning. Because the reality is we only know how to fix. You were just trying to fix.
Yes.
And we want to find meaning. We want to find the love. And when we find the meaning in the love, it does help us gently begin to ride the horse in the direction it's going. You know, death is something none of us want. None of us want our loved ones to die. And I see so many situations of people who, when their loved one died, their pet died, their spouse, their partner, their child, they were Googling a cure, or they were in the hallway demanding something else be done from the doctor.
We were holding our pet with a pet communicator on the phone with us. Or actually, no, she spoke with us afterwards. We had just gotten a session so that she could communicate with her pet to see if there was anything left that we could do.
And the reality is, how can we just be present? How can we be present?
Yes.
You know, you would never go out to a sunset and start yelling at the sunset, stop it, I don't want you to set. You would try your best, even though you may be so sad this wonderful day is coming to an end. There is a beauty in the sunset if you look for it. And it doesn't mean you want the day to end. None of us want our loved ones to die. But raging at the sunset is a ridiculous concept that we've somehow taken on as a sign of strength. So I believe in finding meaning in addition to the pain.
Thank you.
By the way,
Yeah.
and I want to make sure I let people know because the book is coming out now. All these things we're talking about, so easy to talk about, harder to do. This is really some of the most challenging times. And my prayer and hope is that this book helps people deeply. But I also know this is so hard. I created a companion course to go along with the book that is absolutely free when you get the book. And it's a really robust 7-video series course because I want to help people step by step find meaning in these areas. So the information on the book and the course can be found at sixthstage.com, like six, SIXTH, stage.com, or you can go to grief.com, which is my website, and see how no matter where you buy the book, I hope people buy it in physical stores. You can also buy it online from your indie bookstore. The companion course is free with it because I would love for people to find meaning.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Sure.
Before this, you just mentioned a very interesting word, rage. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
And the reality is, and I explain this when you look into this, that was the rant of someone who was deep in addiction, upset about his father's blindness. And somehow we've taken that story and we've turned it into fight against death. And that's not what it was even about.
It seems more like, and there was another theatrical reference here, Thornton Wilder's play Our Town. And Helen Hunt, when you watched it, got to go back and live just one day of her life. And I think that's meaning that we can take away from this as well.
And the shocking thing about that is when she got to go back and live one day, she started thinking about, oh my gosh, I got to choose an important day. Maybe a wedding day, maybe a birth, maybe a this. And she was told, choose an ordinary day. It will be enough. And that idea that even our most ordinary day could be enough for us. So we look for the magic, and sometimes we miss the extraordinary in the ordinary.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about shaping meaning, playing with the mind. What in the world do big purple elephants have to do with anything?
So I ask people to remove some words from their vocabulary. Never and always. You'll hear people say, I'm never going to be happy again. I'm always going to be in pain. And I'll go, first of all, let's just test that. We don't even know if that's true. Really, what I hear you're saying is right now, today, you're in pain. Today, you're unhappy. We actually don't know what next month, next year, next week looks like. But we know you're in pain today. The other thing that people will say is, I can't get over this grief. I can't get rid of this pain. So first of all, can't is about the future. And, Henry Ford had a saying, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. If you think you can't live with this grief, you're right. It's going to be too hard to live with. But we don't get over grief. We can learn to live with it and live with it in a way that honors our loved one. And sometimes people go, no, you don't understand. I can't do it. And I'm going, that's your mind convincing you can't. And they go, I know, I can't change how I'm thinking. I have these bad memories. I can't change it. And I'll just say to my audience, everyone close your eyes. Could you all quickly picture a purple elephant? Raise your hand when you see a purple elephant. Everyone's hands go up. They can see a purple elephant. And I go, I just changed your thoughts. That easy. I went into your mind and got you to change your thinking. Don't let your mind convince you you're a victim of your thoughts. You control your thoughts. I don't, and there's the call now from the great beyond saying,
I love it.
Right. So the other thing is to recognize the idea that this blue shirt didn't just appear on me today. I had to go into my closet and choose this shirt. It would be ridiculous for me to go, Michael, I don't know how these shirts keep getting on me. They just appear every day. But we say that about our thoughts. I don't know how these thoughts happen. They just happen. No, we're choosing them. And that is not to blame ourselves for those thoughts. It is to make ourselves aware of how we can not get rid of the bad moments in life, but we can choose additional moments of meaning to help them.
Which means it all comes down to the D word without putting pressure on people. When the time is right, you can make a decision.
And meaning is a decision. You have to start with, I'm going to make a decision that there's more to their life and our relationship than the death. I'm going to decide that I'm going to look for ways to honor their life. I'm going to find meaning in not how they died, but how their life touched me, what their life meant to me. If their death was tragic, then maybe I could find meaning by trying to create a world so other people don't die in that tragic way as much. But most of the time, we're finding meaning in the life that they lived and how we can live a life that honors them.
Woohoo! You have a beautiful picture up behind you. I don't think it'll show on video, but it's you and Mother Teresa. And you mentioned her in the book, and I believe you met her like in the last year of her life. And
Yes.
she told you life is an achievement.
And death is part of that achievement. You know, for me, birth is a moment, death is a moment. We don't define our relationships by our birth, nor should we define them by our death. And just living this life is so important. And somehow, you know, my first book was a book called The Needs of the Dying. And I talked about life's last chapter. It's almost in our society become the throwaway chapter. And yet I believe it's one of the most meaningful chapters.
That's what I was alluding to earlier as we put people away.
Right.
When they start to become sick and infirmed versus draw them in closer.
Right. And that's a psychological event. That's not a comment about where they're at. You can be present with them in the nursing home, in the hospital, in the hospice, in the assisted living. It's about your presence.
Thank you. Speaking of presence, how do we know when it's time to be present? So two things come to mind. A puppy passed away, or not a puppy, an older dog passed away with you, I believe a half a year after your son, 6 months, and then choosing to get a puppy again. And for other people, there is choosing, would I be dishonoring my loved one?
Right. So such a good question. So let me just, there's a few things in there. First of all, I told the story probably about 2 months after my son died. Not only ours, but some other good friends had a, pet pass away after 17 years. A friend who was a yoga dance teacher at 43 years old died. And I was comforting them. And they said to me, how can you comfort us when your son died? I mean, isn't that the worst grief? And I always tell people, the worst grief is your grief. And I could never look at someone whose beloved dog died after 17 years that they were with every day for 17 years, or someone whose best friend died. I could never look at another person and go, your tears don't count. Everyone's tears count. So it's so important we recognize that. The other thing that was true for me, there is no timeline in grief, but no one should tell you if you should get remarried, if you should have another child, if you should have another dog, or when. Those are all individual decisions. In my life, my son had died. I have another son, an older son, and there had been what I thought of And it was about a year after my son had died. There had been so much subtraction.
Mhm.
I wanted to find a little addition. And that was bringing a puppy into my life. So that's little lovely Lucy, who, by the way, is like 80 pounds and still thinks she's a lap dog. So,
Awesome, awesome, awesome. What is Takotsubo, Brokenhearted Syndrome?
so we often talk about someone died from a broken heart. I loved actually researching that and finding out there is actually this physical disorder
Mhm.
that is broken heart syndrome, that you really physically can die of a broken heart. And we see this all the time when someone's grandparents, one grandparent dies, then the other dies right after. You see this with spouses and family members who have, been together, married for 50 years. So it's such an
George
interesting
Bush.
George Bush after Barbara Bush, that idea that it's such an interesting example of a true mind body connection that we actually physically are affected by loss. Paul Denniston does grief yoga, talking about the mind body connection. So, how do we deal with what we feel in our body in grief?
Yeah. I was saying Princess Leia. I don't know why her name is escaping me, and then her mom passing away the
Carrie
next day.
Fisher, right. Debbie Reynolds died right after Carrie Fisher.
So what does that mean as to how we dive into our own bodies then?
Well, we get stuck in our grief. You know, Paul Denniston, who I mentioned that does grief yoga, talks about the body remembers,
Yes.
and so much of grief and trauma gets stored in our bodies, and it's a wonderful way to gently release it in our bodies. Well, Paul and I do events every year together at different retreat centers, Kripalu, Esalen. So you can find out information on all my events and retreats and lectures at grief.com. Click under the events or grief.com/events.
Mhm.
I have retreats, I have lectures, but there's a lot of, we use yoga in a lot of the retreats, the grief yoga. And anyone who's not familiar with Paul's work can find out about him at griefyoga.com because grief is something that does take dedicated time and we need to allow it. So there is such a strong mind body connection.
Thank you. Please tell us about this mantra of yours. I think it's one of your favorites. It's your job to honor your own grief.
Right.
No one else can even understand it.
So, what you think about someone else's grief, how they're grieving is not your business. Their judgment of your grief is actually not your business either. If
Cool.
someone else thinks you're not grieving enough or grieving too much, none of your business. All we have control over is honoring our own grief and taking care of our own grief. Grief is what's on the inside. Mourning is what we do on the outside. I can't dive into Michael and help him with his grief. I can't even see your grief. I might see a few tears, which is your act of mourning. But if we have family members, we can't help them grieve. We can only model grieving for them. If we have kids we worry about, we can't nag kids or talk kids into grieving. We can only model grief for them. Model that we're sad,
Mhm.
model that we have good memories, model that we can find meaning, modeling our feelings. We only have control over our own grief.
Thank you. Since you mentioned meaning, I want to go to Viktor Frankl for a very brief minute because to me this whole book is peppered with his influence. What can you tell us about visiting the city of Hamburg?
Well, it was fascinating to me when I went to Hamburg. I was naive. I looked around at this modern European city and I'm like, it's so modern. Why is it modern? And I was very ignorant. Someone said, well, because the Americans and the British bombed us and destroyed the whole city. in World War II, and that had escaped my knowledge and memory. I certainly knew about Hitler and World War II. And so they said, you must go see the church St. Nikolai. And in this amazing modern city, in the middle is this church, St. Nikolai, that stands there completely devastated as it was during the bombing. It has never been restored. And it stands there in this modern city. And I thought about even the grief with my own son, how there is a part of me and a part of my heart that will be forever devastated by his loss. My heart will, that hole will never be filled until I'm with him again. But it doesn't mean I can't, just like St. Nikolai, build an amazing city around that piece of my heart that honors him. And that meaning can help me grow and flourish in a way that when that day comes that I see my son again, and he says to me, wow, you had 40 more years or 20 more years after I died. Wasn't Earth great? What about the food? What about the sky? What about the sunsets? I don't want to say to him, oh yeah, I quit paying attention to that after you died. My son would never want his death to have contracted my life. He would want me to grieve fully, but then also live fully in his honor. And that's all our work, is to grieve fully and live fully.
Woohoo! This has been phenomenal, David. I have just a few more questions. I feel like bringing us full circle. This is going to be such a, I don't even know if Hail Mary is the question, but I know that the minute I'm done, I'm going to go to Jessica. I'm going to say we finished our interview, and she's going to say, well, what did you ask him about our year of grief? And so I don't even know what to ask, but any words for Jessica here?
There is a myth around that there's a year of grief.
Well, in this case, we've had the 2 miscarriages, one family member, one pet, all in the last year.
Oh, so sometimes for whatever reason in life, I don't understand why, we just have these seasons where we have so much death. I mean, it certainly happened to me, and I'm so heartbroken that this is your season now. But I join with you that as you go through this pain, to know you are not alone. And we all walk with you and send you love. And my hope is that this season will pass for you and you will go on to other seasons. And there will be other seasons of life and there will be other seasons of death. But that is how this world works. For every winter, there is a spring. For every spring, there's a summer. For every summer, there's a fall. And that's how this life works. And our job is to be present in all those seasons as we go through them. Not to be people who in winter go, it shouldn't be winter, it should be summer. And not people who are in spring going, I wish it was winter, but to be present in the season we're in.
Thank you, thank you. And then I guess I better let you say what I had cut you off, which is a year of mourning.
So there's this myth that we're done in a year, and that's not true. You know, grief continues on, but it's also about love and not just pain.
Thank you. Any last words of wisdom you want to share with people today?
Just, I would love if we can connect, and however that is helpful to people, whether that's getting the book and whether that's getting the free online companion course that goes with it. I have many other books. I have many other online classes. They can find them at grief.com. Just also know at grief.com, with my online classes that I have control over, no one's ever turned away for a lack of funds. So I want to make sure people have access to help whenever they want. If people feel moved to see me at a lecture or retreat, I'm going to be in 30 cities across the US, then the UK, then Australia. So they can find those all at grief.com events too, and I hope we get to connect there.
Awesome. What came up while you were saying this, one last thing is, what's the power of a hug?
The power of a hug is really the power of grief being witnessed and connected. And for some, it's not a hug. For some, it's just someone seeing their pain. But really, when you talk about the power of a hug, the hug is one form of connection. And we all desire connection.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for doing this.
Big man hug.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get finding meaning, and begin healing your heart today and shine bright. Woohoo! Thank you so much, David.
Oh, you're so welcome. You're so welcome.
I just had the most heartfelt interview with David Kessler on finding meaning. To check out more incredible videos on healing your heart, click here, subscribe below.